I love this cartoon. This is from a underground comic for people who smoke way too much marijuana. And it's called, these people are the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, and they were created by Gilbert Shelton, who was one of the first underground cartoonists and one of the least pathological ones with the best sense of humor. And he writes these stories about these stupid hippies, 3 of them, the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. You see 2 of them there, and all they do is smoke pot and avoid responsibility and run away from the police, and but it's a nice satire. And they have this cat, and the fat one, Fat Freddy, has the cat, and they're too lazy to even give the cat a name, so it's Fat Freddy's cat, and it has its own adventures, mostly with like an army of cockroaches that lives inside their like horrible slummy hellhole of a living place. And so anyways, it's quite comical. And so the hippies have stumbled across a small fortune, and stoned out of their minds on cocaine, they go out to set up utopia in the countryside. And they buy this terrible piece of property, but they're so deluded that they think it's like a mansion. And they bring their cat, and I don't know if you've ever had a cat, but cats don't like to move. It really bugs them. And so they're not comfortable when you bring them to a new place. They're like the rat that's been taken out of its comfortable cage and put into a new cage. And the cat, you put a cat in a new room, and it, depending on the cat obviously, but generally they'll retreat into a corner and meow piteously and be very unhappy for quite a substantial amount of time. And so the cartoonist actually mapped this out quite nicely. So the hippie takes the cat out of the box and says, "Our new home." They're out in the forest. This is an urban cat. It's never been in the forest. It doesn't know what the hell's up in the forest. And the cat's looking rather dubiously and thinks, so this is the country. And then it's put on the ground, and it starts to slink, as he says, slink, slink, out into the forest. And that's actually what animals do. It's a predator evasion crouch. And so if they're put in a new territory, they'll hunker down and freeze first, and then they'll slowly unfreeze and start to explore. They sniff first, and then they'll start to move. But they do it like with trepidation and slowly, and try to hide. And so that's what the cat's doing. And the cat goes out into the unknown far enough, sniffing, and all of a sudden, pow! It goes underneath the house. It's like the toddler running back to the mother. And another hippie there, I think that's Phineas, says, "Where'd the cat disappear to now?" And the Fat Freddy character says, "Under the house." And then the cat's under there in the dark with big eyes looking terrified, saying, "You'd hide too if you'd smelled what I did." And so what it smelled was this thing that has like the head of a wolf, and antlers like a deer, and the tail of a skunk, and the feet of like a chicken, and horrible claws. It's like, well, what is that? Well, it's a monstrous amalgam of that which lurks in the unknown. And so the cartoonist, the comedian, got it perfect. Said, well, what is there, what is out in the unknown? Well, you need one representation, not 1,000. And so you take pieces of what's out there that are relevant, and you create a single image out of that, and you say, well, this is what's out there. And you might say, well, no such animal as that exists. And that's actually incorrect. An animal very much like that exists. It's just a superordinate low resolution category. It includes all those weird animals that might hurt you that are out in the forest. That's a useful category. Weird animals that might hurt you. And that's a real category. You know, you might say, well, there's differentiated things within that category. It's like, yeah, every category has that nature. It can still be further differentiated, maybe not protons, you know. They can even be differentiated with regards to location at least. So every category can be further differentiated. The question is whether the category has some functional utility, or at least that's one of its questions. It's like, that's the thing to be afraid of. Okay, good, now you got it. This is the category of all things to be afraid of. What do you do in response to that category? All right, so then we go to the next representation. This is Kali, K-A-L-I. Hindu goddess of destruction. She's the thing that you encounter, she's the thing that makes things go bump in the night. What is that thing? Well, let's take it apart a little bit. Because you can't see this image until you understand it. You would be able to if you were Hindu, because you'd be in the culture and you'd know what the image represented. But some people in here might be Hindu, but not very many people. So okay, so let's talk about this image. It's a horrifying image. And so here's how this image emerged. It emerged in the imagination of people who were tormented for millennia about just what the hell lurked out there in the unknown. And some artist was seized by a revelation, a horrifying revelation of just what that was. Okay, so what is it? Well, first of all, she's in a container of fire. Why fire? Well, fire is useful and destructive, right? And you also cannot look away from fire. And so it's a really good symbol of that which you cannot look away from. It's eternally meaningful. Fire is eternally meaningful. Why? We can't keep our hands off fire, right? We're descendants of the first insane ape who was so obsessed by fire that he couldn't stay away from a burning landscape and learned how to master it. He's our forefather, that person. We're obsessed by fire. It's magical to us. And it transforms, it burns and transforms. So from a symbolic perspective, it's a very useful source of imagistic representation. Okay, the fire is there, and then inside the fire, these are skulls. You see them? All lined up there. So it's not just fire, it's the fire of death that consumes. So that's where Kelly lives. So that's fun to start with. And then there she is with her hair on fire, because her hair's on fire, in case she isn't frightening enough just because of where she lives. Her hair is on fire, and her headdress is made out of skulls. So that's nice. And then she's like an insect, like a spider. See, she has all these legs. And why is that? It's because we don't really like insects. And they set off our bug detectors, and they can bite us, and they're quite horrifying. And many people have spider phobias, particularly. And no wonder. And then she's got a weapon in one hand here, and then you see she's eating something. And you see here her belly is concave. Well, why? Well, she's in a birth position. She's just given birth to this unfortunate character who she happens to be standing upon, and he's disemboweled, and she's eating him intestines first. And that's Kelly. It's like, that's horror. It's a representation of horror and death and destruction and transformation. It's feminine as well. What do you do in the face of Mother Nature? That's another negative element of Mother Nature. What do you do with something like this? Well, that's the eternal question. And the answer is quite straightforward. You make sacrifices to her. And if you make the proper sacrifices, then she turns into her beneficial counterpart. And that's exactly what you do in life. If in the face of horror and death, you make sacrifices, so you transform the terrible destructive element of nature into that thing that continually offers you what you need. That discovery is one of unparalleled brilliance. And we don't get it. We think it's primitive. And no wonder, you can understand human sacrifice. That sounds pretty primitive, man. It's terrifying. But the idea of sacrifice, it's an act of, the idea itself is a conceptualization of utter genius. And why do you expect it to come forward first in its perfect form? It's not going to do that. It's going to come forward imperfectly and roughly and brutally, and then hopefully be refined across time, which is exactly what has happened. You see, even in the biblical stories, the transition from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice. And then with us now, it's a transition from animal sacrifice to psychological sacrifice, because we're sophisticated enough to do that. We can let go of concepts and abstractions and things that we're holding on to that we should no longer hold on to, and progress in that manner. It's increasing articulated psychological sophistication. But we still make sacrifices, and we hope that they'll be accepted, and we hope that they're of high enough quality so that they work. Well, that's a representation of Diana. You could think of Diana, there's an opposite, Durga, in Hinduism, and she comes forth if you make the proper sacrifices to Kelly. But I wanted to show you alternative representations from different cultures of these archetypal forms. This is Diana, positive feminine, multi-breasted, right? She's the thing that nourishes the world. And so that would be, on one hand, your mother, who obviously protects you from the terrible aspects of fire and danger, but also nature conceptualized as the positive feminine in general. The source of all fertility and all food and all beings and all good things. Something that you want to have on your side, that's for sure. And you might say, if you acted heroically, properly, and you played the metagame and not the game, and you made the proper sacrifices, then you'd never encounter Kelly, you'd only encounter her benevolent counterpart. And so then you might say, well, does she even exist then? And that's something that's very interesting, is because the degree to which the terrible part of the world manifests itself in your life is proportionate to how insufficient you are. And we don't know the full extent of that. If you got your act together completely, maybe all the suffering would disappear from your life, or at least maybe all the unbearable suffering, and maybe all the suffering or the unbearable suffering from the lives of people around you too. And you already know that, because there are people that you'll go to in a crisis that you can rely on, and you know they'll help you, and you wonder what the world would be like if you were like that and everyone else was like that too. We'd have a lot fewer crises, and the ones that we do have would be a lot more manageable. And so when people say, well, why is the world so rife with suffering, one answer to that is because we're not yet what we could be. And at least that's an answer that we have some control over, right? You're not going to talk God out of making the world suffer, that's for sure. And you're not going to negotiate directly with Mother Nature, but you might be able to put yourself together a little bit and see if that works. At least it's under your control. And God only knows what the upper limit of that might be. Well, here's the decomposition of the fundamental archetype. The dragon of chaos differentiates, on the one hand, into the feminine, that's the unknown, and the feminine differentiates further into the negative feminine and the positive feminine. The negative feminine is the reason for witch hunts. It's the reason for, you know, there's a whole group online called Men Going Their Own Way, MGTOW. That's a very interesting group to go study. There's lots of them. I don't know how many of them there are, and most of them are older. Many of them are men who've been through a particularly horrifying divorce for one reason or another, and they've had enough of women. So they tell the young men that they're teaching, never have a permanent relationship, never share your territory with a woman, never share your possessions, make sure you never live together, and don't stay with one long enough to enter a common law relationship, because you will be stripped of everything that you have. Well, that's a hell of a thing to be telling people, but what's happened is that the female has been manifested in their life only as the negative archetype, and they've got that confused with all women. And that's partly, you know, you got to ask yourself, if you know the mythological stories, maybe if you made the right sacrifices you wouldn't have so much trouble with women. It's a good question to ask yourself first. And I would also say, you know, if you're a woman who has trouble with men, or you're a man who has trouble with women, it's not the women and it's not the men, it's you. Because the women are telling you what's wrong with you, and the men are telling you what's wrong with you. And if you don't listen, then it's you. It's either you or all men. Well, that's easy, it's all men. Well, that's certainly how it's played out in the world right now. It's like, no, it's not all men. You can be, by definition, and it's not all women, that's for sure. I don't want to have anything to do with women. It's like, you're a pathetic weasel. That's the same statement. Here's some lovely representations. This is Mary, represented in very different eras. This is a very old one. This is about 12th century. I absolutely love this image. It's so profound. So what you see here is Mary as eternal mother of the infant. Okay, she's sitting on the crescent moon here. She's queen of the night. And underneath, you can't see this very well, but underneath the moon there's a reptile, and she's got it crunched nicely underneath her feet, and that's Satan in part, which means protect your children from malevolence, and it's the predator. And so what's the proper orientation for a mother? Protect your infant from malevolent predators, obviously, right? That's the holy image of the mother. So she's holding the infant safely in her arms. She's queen of the universe, and she's coming out of this strange tunnel. It's the same, these are called a mandorla, by the way, this tunnel. And it's actually, this is going to be very strange, but I'm going to tell you what it is anyways. It's like a hole into the fabric of time and space, and it's revealing an image that's eternal, that's outside of time and space. And it's outside of time and space because it recurs all the time. It never ages. It's an image that transcends temporality. Now you might say, well, is it real? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what you mean by real. Something that transcends temporality is pretty damn real. And so that's what that hole in the sky represents. It also represents the place from which all forms emerge. So there's a biological component to it too, right? So it's as if the as if these divine figures are standing in front. Well, I'll show you in a minute of what they're standing in front of. And you see here the same thing with these little putti, that's what they're called, sort of embedded in the flesh-like folds around here. And you see Mary here holding the infant again away from the terrible predator. That's the serpent of chaos down there in the ocean. And that's, again, what does that mean? Why would the serpent of chaos be in the ocean? Well, how many of our ancestral infants do you suppose were eaten by crocodiles at the water hole? And plenty of them. And so that's something to be terrified of and to take precautions against. And then this image here, the older one, see all these weird little figures in the background here. You can't see them, but they're musical instruments. They're all sorts of archaic musical instruments. And so here's what the image means. It means the potential from which this figure is emerging is like a musical construction. So it's like a symphony. It's this patterned layer, it's patterns, layer upon layers of harmonious patterns that make up being. And out of that emerges this image. And that's what that image represents. And that's what music represents. It represents this patterned potential that we're constantly interacting with. It's deeply, deeply meaningful. That's why we love music so much. But that's an absolute work of genius to put those two things together. It's remarkable, remarkable image. So